years ago, our program director, Mark Pierson, came to a meeting and said that he had just read an outstanding book on experience design. It was called Curating Worship. We were surprised, because Bjarke is not a religious man, but he was right about the book. Our first speaker here today is the author of that book. He's a worship curator and a faith space designer from New Zealand. And I'm especially happy about this to present him today, because in this age when religion is quite often cast as an enemy to all civilization, it makes sense for us to talk to each other about what we have in common and what we can learn from these practices of faith. Whether we are believers or not, faith and worship have an undeniable place in human experience. Please welcome, I'm sorry, Mark Pierson. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. In the language of the indigenous people of New Zealand, which is not English, but Māori, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, which means greetings, or if we feel that we know each other really well, we could say kia ora, which means hi. I am from New Zealand. I feel as if I could put my title over everything that Johanna has just said and save you half an hour. But I'm going to apply some things a little more to the specific role that I have. I come from New Zealand, as I said, which is a long way away from here. I don't know much about Sweden, apart from Absolute Vodka and ABBA and IKEA, which has not yet made its way to New Zealand. I have to go to Australia to buy IKEA. Minecraft, Muppet Chefs, a few things like that. Maybe you know a little bit about New Zealand at the bottom of the world, where the best rugby team in the world lives, the All Blacks. Maybe you know a little bit about Hobbiton, the Lord of the Rings. Just to remind you that Hobbiton does not really exist. It was built recently by ordinary people in New Zealand. You can go and see it anytime you like. Maybe good wine, Lord of the Rings, all of that kind of stuff. So I don't know much about you, and probably you don't know very much about me. I'm a pastor, a minister in the Baptist Church in New Zealand. I currently work with the International Aid and Development Agency World Vision in New Zealand, and I'm responsible for the spiritual nurture of staff and for our relationships with churches. So it's a Protestant church setting. And my passion is designing interactive worship experiences in the context of the Christian church. And in 1994, Brian Eno, who is an English musician, composer, artist, curator, thinker, first coined the word ambient music. He said this: "The word is out and the word is wrong. Interactive is the wrong word." And Eno proposed that we use the word unfinished instead of interactive. And he wants his tombstone to read, "Interactive is the wrong word, it should be." Interactive means unfinished. And by Eno's definition, the participant in an interactive experience is invited to complete that experience in some way. Not simply to engage passively with something that's preordained, predecided, like moving a mouse around a screen, or reading what someone else has written, but completing the experience in some way, an unfinished experience. And of course, that means the outcome, what is experienced from that interaction, is largely out of the control of the experience designer. Using Eno's definition, if there is no choice about how to complete or to finish the task, then there is no interaction. It's just a task, and the experience is boring. And many of my experiences of church services have been very boring. This boy is in church in Samoa, and I could not stay awake myself going to church in Samoa. I understand that since around 2000, Sweden has no longer had a state church. But 2/3 of the population are still members of the Church of Sweden, although only about 4% attend services with any regularity. And in New Zealand, we've never had a state church. It's always been self-funded by those who participate in it. And early settlers were mostly people who had come from England, Mother England, to New Zealand to escape the kind of religious and social institutions and systems that they wanted to leave behind, to get away from them. And regular church attendance in New Zealand runs at maybe 8 or 9% of the population, and that's declining. Who here has been to a Christian church service in the past year, whether it's a wedding or a funeral or something? Okay, most of you, very culturally Christian country at least. I wonder how that experience was for you. As someone who designs experiences, how did you find your church experience? How interactive was it? How engaging? How participatory? And did you expect it to be more or less, or just what it was? Church services, what I prefer to call worship events, and I've experienced a lot of them in a lot of different cultures, in my own country, other countries, are usually already completed before anyone sits on a pew. All the work's been done in advance by the minister or the priest or the worship leader, depending on what sort of cultural variation of church you go to. I might get to sing songs chosen by someone else, sung to music chosen by someone else, and played by someone else. But mostly I get to sit and to listen. My brain and my bottom are the most engaged parts of me, and both of them are probably going to sleep. The high point of interaction and engagement is deciding whether I'll have tea or coffee afterwards, and whether I will finish that interaction by adding milk or sugar or not. So the level of interaction is minimal, and the value of the experience is low, in my opinion. And people are walking out of the church and not going back, and it's happening in every country in the West. Now, as a person of faith who believes that the message Jesus brought to humanity is a life-changing one that liberates a person to know who they are and to become more fully human, knowing that people are rejecting the story because of the medium transmitting it is so poor, because the medium transmitting it is so poor, that makes me quite angry. The medium is the message. At its most basic, we call liturgy the form of a worship event. The liturgy, the word means the work of the people, or public service. It's not the work of the leader. And I'm simplifying things significantly, but liturgy that doesn't engage the community seems to me not to be worship. So all of this stuff is going on in my life, all of these questions, and so I wondered what I could do about it. What was the answer? And I decided that the answer was for the church to be less concerned with finding the right answers and more concerned with finding the right questions. The solution to this lack of engagement, participation, interaction, and the fact that people were showing their disapproval, their dislike, their boredom by moving outside of the church, was to ask better questions about the church itself. And I believe it's because we haven't been asking these most basic questions that the church has got itself into the situation it is currently in. Questions like, why should people go to church at all? other than for weddings, funerals, baptisms and things like that. Why should people go to church? Why would we expect them to? Why would people want to go to church? And then when they're there, what do we want to achieve with a worship event, with this story that we tell week after week? And what sort of people are our worship events producing? And because we haven't asked those most basic questions, we've never had to answer them, which is very comfortable and convenient. And we've never had to evaluate our success or failure. And I believe that we need to bring the principles and practices of what I call worship curation, or in other words, experience design, to the life of the church and to its worship events in particular. Johanna referred to this book, which I wrote a few years ago before I had ever heard of the terms design experience, or experience design, or designing experiences, or live action role play, or any of those kinds of terms. I knew that I was deeply dissatisfied with my experience of church. I knew the opportunities to participate and engage were minimal, and that engagement that allowed for interactivity, for finishing in Eno's definition, was virtually non-existent. In fact, even creativity was looked on with suspicion, and the head was definitely valued over the heart. I wasn't raised in the church. I was a 19-year-old convert. I had lots of questions that no one wanted to answer. In fact, no one was asking them out loud anyway. No, not questions about theology, but about practice. And so I have two starting questions for all the worship events that I curate. Why does the church exist? You know, what do worship services exist to do? What do we expect from them? And what are we expecting the worship event to do? And I have my own very simple, straightforward answers. You can find rooms of books in the theological libraries that answer these questions. My simple working definition is to say that the church exists, this is the Christian church, exists to sustain people in their following of Jesus Christ in the world. Simple, straightforward. That's why there is a church. Others would disagree or argue, and they're welcome to do. And what do worship services exist to do? Well, corporate public worship is the practices of people interacting with the Trinitarian community of God with heart, soul, mind, strength. So this just differentiates the church from Rotary or young animal supporters clubs or whatever they might be. And these definitions are very, very important to me. Not what the definition actually is, but my answering those two questions. What does the church exist for? What does worship exist to do? And they guide and shape every worship experience that I curate. And I use the term curate because it's the first term in a new language that I believe we need to develop if we are going to design worship events that will enable people to engage with God and become more fully human rather than less so. And the term comes from an art gallery curator. We could choose a museum curator, but it would seem not a good idea to parallel the church and a museum, but rather the church and an art gallery kind of works better. So what does the gallery curator do? Well, she has the space, and all of the works are unloaded in the middle of the space, and she determines how they will be displayed, perhaps in conjunction with the artist. So she determines all of the things that Johanna talked about earlier, the lighting levels, the temperature, the colour of the walls, the shape of the space, whether it will be divided up in different ways. And then she unpacks all the works and she displays them around the walls or in the centre. And she decides what will go next to another piece and what the distance apart will be and how far the viewers will be able to stand back from that piece of work and what they'll see when they first walk in the door and all of those kinds of things. And she knows that the way she answers all of those questions affects the story that is told by those pieces of art. She knows that changing the order of those pieces, changing the temperature, making it very hot, making it very cold, making it a black space instead of a white space. All of those things are going to affect the story that is told. She also knows that all she can do is to arrange these elements in a way to tell the story that she wants to tell, but she knows that there is no guarantee anyone else entering the space will go away with the same story. And she and the artists are happy with that. They understand that. I'm wanting to have the Christian church in the West understand worship is an art form that needs to be curated. So I am a worship curator. I aggregate, prune, and arrange elements. I pull all this stuff together. I pull things together that aren't necessarily connected. I collect ideas and practices from any source, ancient or contemporary. Anything's considered. And then I prune, and I arrange, I curate. I cut down, I reduce what tells, while I'm getting toward what story I want to tell. And then I invite people to engage, to interact with that story. And I do that in the context of church-based worship events and sacred spaces outside the church in public places. And these are my magic circles. What scares many people, especially church leaders, with this new vocabulary of interactivity being unfinished, of worship curators, is that it sounds horribly like they will no longer be in control. They will no longer be able to control the message, what people go away with. They will lose control, is the great fear. And I want to say absolutely. If that's where you come from, then that should be your fear. You will lose control. And then I would want to respond with a question of whether worship should ever have been about control or power that isn't shared. And people already leave church services with their own story anyway, and most of them aren't coming back. The story of Jesus itself is about someone who gave up power and control. Now, in the same way that the curator of an art installation can't control the message that people go away with, in any curated worship event, people can react and respond and interact in ways that the curator hadn't expected. And that is to be hoped for as a curator. My understanding is that God speaks and engages with people in a variety of ways and about a whole lot of different things, and that is the work of God's Spirit. A while ago, I curated a Stations of the Cross installation. Stations of the Cross being works of art, usually, out from history, representing the last, say, 14, usually 14, little events out of Jesus' life between when he was arrested through to when he was crucified. And so we stripped out our small building of all the pews and seats and everything else and hung black fabric around the walls. It was only a small space, less than half the size of this one downstairs. And then put the pieces of artwork around. And because it's an old building and a small space, it just has one main entrance on the way in here. And then at the other end of the small hall, there was a door that lets you out for an emergency exit. Because my black fabric had covered all the walls, I thought that we should do something about having an emergency exit. So we just put a slit in the fabric and overlapped it and wrote a little sign, emergency exit. So you come in and you turn to the right and you went round the room. These various pieces of art that were there representing the Stations of the Cross. And it's open for 3 or 4 days and stuff into the evening and things like that. And afterwards, I had an email from a theological student who said that Stations of the Cross this particular year, and we've done it for about 12 years, had been a really profound experience for him. He felt very moved. He described it in terms of he felt that God had spoken to him about something. And so I thought, oh, okay. Before I read the rest of the letter, I was wondering which piece of art or the design of the whole space which had spoken to him most strongly. It turned out it was the emergency exit sign. He said, I came in and I walked around the stations, Jesus' trial, Jesus before Pilate, or the Last Supper, Jesus' trial before Pilate, these things through. And he said, and I got halfway through to the emergency exit sign, and I hadn't come round to the end yet, to the death of Jesus. He said, I realized that at any time, Jesus could have escaped. He could have got out. He could have changed the story. But because of love, he chose to go right through to the end. That was a profound experience for him. And of course, as the curator, I knew that that was a possibility, and I had arranged it specially. No. If I am true to my definitions of the church and worship and interactivity and curating, then open-endedness and uncertainty about how people will respond is expected in the process, and it's to be welcomed. This is content-driven creativity, not creativity for the sake of it, and not creativity to show people how creative I am, but creativity that treats the biblical content seriously and is just as serious about how it invites people to engage with it. Here is an example of a worship event in a standard Baptist church. In fact, it's a standard church. It's not a Baptist church, but it looks very much like this, except it's probably 5 times larger, but it has this big range of pillars around the back. Now we're looking here underneath a sheet that wasn't normally there. I didn't take a photograph before it. It's put there in order to reduce the size of the space and to project on. Then some trailer loads of ice trucked in, up the front, creating this kind of space. Then a regular service with some irregularities in it. Instead of having the Bible carried in, I had a person dressed in a white forensic kind of CSI jumpsuit who brought the elements for each of the stations in that we were going to use in this. So ordinary service, some songs, a preacher, things like that, and then this begins, this 30 minutes of interaction, responding to stations that were actually based around Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. First one, anger. I can't remember what the invitation to participate was, but the response was pulling petals off the flowers on a funeral wreath. Barbed wire crosses with which you scratched in blocks of ice, your confessions, a crown of barbed wire with icicles dripping down into the ice below, a piece of video running on the walls on that white sheet behind it, just simply a person breathing out in a slow kind of rhythm. And there you see the stations set in various places around. There's whole lots of them going on there for people to engage with. So that is a curated worship event. It's in a church building. It's a regular kind of expected service, Good Friday service. And it's an ordinary service with this slab of 30 minutes or so in the middle of interaction and engagement. When I'm curating, this is the process that I will go through. Whether it's inside the church in a weekly worship event, or whether it's one-off special or outside. I start always with the biblical text for me. The theme, the verse, the story, whatever it is. Then I research the context. If it's my own community and congregation, then I'm already familiar with what that will be, but who the people are coming, what the space is like, whether people can get out of their seats or not, the reason for this service. I aggregate ideas, collect everything I can. I use a box filing system. I just chuck everything in that over the next few weeks while I'm thinking about it. And then I ask the question, what do I want to say in this service? I'm aware that what I say may not be what people hear, and that is fine. But what do I want to say? What am I wanting people to take away from this? What do I want them to feel and to hear and to understand and to do? And then I select the elements, and I prune, and I put the running order and the stations and the transitions together, and then produce it and deliver it. I have a strong commitment to both biblical content and interactive engagement, but I start with this anything goes attitude to the aggregation of the content. And then keeping in mind my definitions of church and worship and what I want to say and who the audience is, then I prune and curate and shape. So a worship curator is actually a maker of context rather than a presenter of content in worship. In the same way that the art gallery curator doesn't make the works. They're made by someone else. But she curates them, provides the context for them. And it's my answers to those questions that I also measure the outcomes against. Did what I curated enable this interactive engagement by people with the Trinitarian community of God, heart, soul, mind, strength? Did it sustain people in their following of Christ in the world? And so on. Now, I'm going to change tack now. It's going to give out some pieces of newspaper. While those are going out, I'll just talk briefly. This is a church service at the church I'm currently part of, ordinary church service again, following the sermon, 20 minutes of engagement, of interaction, around the story of the Good Samaritan. Here's a victim shape cut out. People are writing the names of victims they know of, or in the media or whatever, on sticking plasters, band-aids, and sticking them on this cutout thing. Following the dead man waiting, the dead man denied the next year. This time we grass turfed the front of the church, built a screen out of umbrellas, put the stations in, did stuff like that. A simple way that I transform very ordinary looking space simply by projecting on the walls and everything else related to it. All right, you have a piece of newspaper in your hands, and I invite you to look through it quickly and to see if there's a phrase or a word or a heading or a picture or an image or something that catches your eye. It's today's paper, so try to avoid the temptation to read it in detail. If you've got a pen, you might like to underline or circle what stood out to you. And now, to look at it again and ask yourself, why did that stand out to me? Why did it connect with me? Is it something that interests me? Something that worries me? Is it a situation that I'd like to see changed or that I'm aware of? Does it remind me of something else? And reflect for just 60 seconds or probably less on the feelings and situation it raises for you, and I invite you to do that in silence. If we were in a church service, a worship event, that would have been our prayers for others, or prayers of intercession, but we would have taken longer about it. I might have used slightly different language in the setting and in introducing that to you in a church setting, but otherwise the process would have been the same. And if we'd been together longer and knew each other better, I might have invited you to call out your heading or your phrase, and that would have been our prayers. Or if it was easy for us to move around, I might have encouraged you to come over and hang on a line that I'd erected in advance. your newspaper clipping with a peg, hang it with a peg, and to walk around and read what other people had settled on, selected. And it doesn't matter to me whether you did something that I'd asked you to do, or whether you wrote your shopping list for tomorrow, or what you came up with. Doesn't matter. I might have also narrowed the field down a little bit and said, find something that speaks to you about an injustice, or that speaks to you about family life, or about what's going on in our culture. And any of those would have been valid in that kind of setting. It doesn't matter what you come up with. Sacred space chooses you. You do not choose it. And I'm content to curate the possibility of a liminal moment of interactivity when you might engage with this Trinitarian community of God, even if you are unaware of what's happening or describe it in different terms. So to conclude, I am a worship curator. I curate structured and ambient spaces. Structured and ambient being a kind of free-flowing, less linear, less directed, but sometimes structured. Sunday morning will be structured. Spaces that offer people the potential for liminal moments, these betwixt and between, these moments when I'm not sure what the outcome is going to be. These liminal moments of individual and corporate transformational interaction, unfinished, the outcome's not predetermined, transformational interaction with the Trinitarian community of God. And if I had one thing to say to you, it would be that if you are an experienced designer and you are part of the church, then don't leave your gifts at the door when you go into the church, but take them with you. Don't leave your day job behind you when you go to be part of your community of faith. Bring it inside, because we desperately need what you have to offer. Thank you.